So welcome to our sixth discussion of Plato's Symposium. We're now discussing agathon. So we've had one half of poetry in Aristophanes. Now we have the other half, comedy, and it's Plato who claims, well, he's the first person to refer to the tragedy and comedy of life. And so somehow the view of life that comprehends both tragedy and comedy is superior to the one or the other. The Greeks invented both of those, tragedy and comedy. But they also invented the comprehensive view. And there's a curious touch at the end of Agathon's speech. He says, I've said some of these things seriously and some in play, as if he's possibly transcending them both. And then at the very end of the dialogue, Socrates is talking, Aristodemus, his devoted follower, although not so devoted to conversation that he stays awake for the most important part of the conversation, which we miss. But he wakes up and Agathon and Aristophanes and Socrates are discussing tragedy and comedy, and Socrates is convincing them both that the person who can compose one by art can compose the other. And presumably, that's a philosophical poetics, that you can comprehend life in both aspects. But Agathon appears to make that claim for himself at the end of his speech. And we'll read as much of his speech as possible. And I'm just going to share the screen. The blipping thing is, I think it's the microphone, this. It usually calms down. I'm hoping it continues to do so. Okay, I have just a one-page handout with some quotes from Aristophanes. Thanks. Quotes from Homer that Agathon makes use of by altering. If I can get. I just want to make reference to one other thing that Socrates says later after Agathon's speech, is he says, I thought that Agathon was going to present me with the head of Gorgias and turn me into a stone. And so he's mixing up the head of the Gorgon, which turns people into stone, and Gorgias, the rhetorician. And he's making a joke about the extremely crowded adjectival compression in the last paragraph of Agathon's speech, which is highly rhetorical. But that reminds us too that at the end of Pausanias' speech, Aristodemus says, well, in Greek he says, Pausanias de Pausamenu. And this is a figure of speech which is called Georgianic, from Gorgias. There are a number of figures of speech attributed to him, and this one is homoio teleuton, which is to have the same, to have rhyming within and at the end of words. And if you count up the syllables, pausanias de pausamenu, it's the same. So it's balanced and it has the same phrase, paus, in it. And in English, you can say something like, when Pausanias then finally paused, or something, pausing in Pausanias. It's weak, but it's there. But that's one figure of speech. And so Aristodemus embodies that figure of speech in order to sarcastically undercut Pausanias. And there's another figure of speech that Gorgias is attributed to Gorgias, which is isokolon, just having equal members, clauses of the same length. And the most famous one is Latin, veni, or according to the latest understanding of the pronunciation, veni, vidi, vici. So not veni, it just sounds so much less authoritative. Which is Caesar's I came, I saw, I conquered. And so the figure of Gorgias as a teacher of how to arrange speech for persuasion on the basis of the fact that there is no truth is in the background of this dialogue. And as we can see that as a whole, because all of the same figures in this dialogue are in the one where Protagoras, the sophist, features, except for Aristophanes, who, as we saw last week, is a radical critic who ends up trying to reinforce the orthodoxy. So I just have to change the microphone back to the proper one. Okay. Okay, so yeah, but these are just little hints of this rhetorical background, and part of that is Agathon, who is a poet, who is an innovator, and he's someone who's been affected by some aspects of the philosophico-scientific revolutions that have been occurring. And he gives this speech as if it's a treatise. He says, my speech will have the following 2 parts. The first part then breaks down into 4 parts, which then breaks down into 3 parts, and so on. And then he does exactly that. Right? And so it has this surface clarity, which disguises a kind of inner confusion. And that's my opening suggestion, and we can read some of the text and see what happens. So we're at 194. I'll make this a lot bigger when I get there. But yeah, was there anything from last week or other points that anyone wanted to discuss first? Right. Then we can do that. Now, where are we? We are at the end of Aristophanes' speech, is at 193e. And at 193e, just at the end, an odd thing occurs. Aristophanes says, just as I beg you, don't make a comedy of my speech so that we can hear Agathon and Socrates. Now, at the beginning, it was Eryximachus who said, I, the doctor and the political coordinator of this meeting, I forbid you to make a comedy when you're meant to be making a speech about the god. And now that's turned around. And Eryximachus says, he doesn't say it was a very good speech, when he says it was a pleasure, it was pleasing, which doesn't sound very erotic. I mean, in Eryximachus' speech, eros is almost identified with pleasure, so there's that. Now, he says, okay, but these two are very intelligent people, so their speeches will be fine. And Socrates says, that is because you yourself put up a fine show in the contest. So fine is this, I don't know why anyone uses that word for beautiful or noble, but you competed beautifully in the agon, agonisdor. So we get the word agony from agon because contestants in a genuine contest are in pain. You competed nobly, Eryximachus. But then he says, if you were where I am now, then you'd be in a worse state because Agathon is going to speak well, as we know. And Agathon falls directly into this trap and says, this is at 194a in the second paragraph on page 23 of our translation. You want to bewitch me, Socrates, Agathon said. You would have me believe that the audience is full of expectation that I shall speak well, and in that way I shall be in turmoil. Now, the word for audience here is the theatre. He regards anyone listening to him as the theatre. He's a showman. And that's part of the underlying theme of his speech, is that he sees himself only in what others see of him. And that's why somewhere near the core of his speech, in description of eros is the eros for fame, as we'll see. Okay, so, but which is a development. Okay, so in Phaedrus, what's eros? Well, it's one person passionately desiring another in a normal sense. And that's good for the other if that person pays for their meals and protects them from violent death. Right? In Pausanias, same thing. So, except now it's useful, instead of being useful for the beloved, it's useful in the development of character for the city. So it's like the laws, which is kind of amusing, because he's pretending to bring two laws together by subverting the law. And then in Eryximachus, it's a power that throughout the whole cosmos, operating in everything. And then in Agathon, who begins by saying, if people knew it's the real power of eros, but again, it's the passionate desire for another who one somehow not thinks, somehow desires as a completion of oneself, as making oneself whole. But none of these people have asked what it is, and for none of them is it actually a god. That's a metaphor for them. It's just a metaphor for an experience. Now, Agathon is going to do two things. One, he's going to show you how a poet constructs a god, because he's a poet, and the poets make the gods. That's one. Two, so eros will be celebrated as a god that he makes. And two, he's going to show there's an eros for something above the passionate desire directed towards another human being, and that's for fame. And those two things go together. That really is annoying, that beeping. Oh, I see.
Can we put it into this one? Yeah. Or does it need to actually be
I
connected
think
to the
it
machine?
should be connected to this one, yeah. And for some reason, they're all just disconnected to the. Thank you.
No, it hasn't reappeared.
Sorry, we're just having a very small technical problem.
Okay, that should come back. Okay, yeah, the microphone's back. Okay, so yeah, Agathon makes this comment about the audience, and Socrates says just before line B at 194, I should surely be forgetful, Agathon, Socrates said, if I did that. I saw your courage and greatness of mind in mounting the platform with the actors and in facing so large an audience when you were about to display your own speeches, and I saw that you were in no way disturbed. So this is a few days ago when he performed the tragedy. He comes out with the chorus, the actors, before the play. And he says, should I now believe that you will be in turmoil on account of us few human beings? Right, so there's part two of the trap. And then Agathon says, what's this, Socrates? Agathon said, you really do not believe that I am so wrapped up in the theatre as not to know that to a man of sense, a few who are sensible are more terrifying than many fools. Now, so Agathon is pretending to something that he doesn't really possess. He's pretending that he is actually more devoted to the discerning few than the applause of the many. But his whole life is dedicated to the applause of the many. Right? But he wants to make this distinction, and that enables between the few and the many, the discerning few and the less discerning many. And Socrates then springs the little trap and says, well, I would surely be in disgrace, Agathon, he said, were I to presume any lack of urbanity in you. Yeah, that's true. Agathon is reliably urbane, as for example, when he pretends that his servants aren't servants. Right? For I know very well that were you to meet anyone you believed wise, you would think more of them than of the many. But I suspect that we shall not prove to be of the wise, for we too were present there at the theatre, and were part of the many. But if you were to meet others who were indeed wise, then you might be ashamed before them, if you were perhaps to believe that you were doing something that is disgraceful or shameful. Is that what you mean? And Agathon says that what you say is true. Okay. A couple of things. So Socrates has said, we were amongst the many. Now, one of the immediate implications is that if you're writing a play, you need to be able to write for the many and the few with the same speech, right? So there's dross, there's, what's that thing, streaming service? Starts with N? Netflix. There's Netflix, right? Just for the many, right? Whereas a capable author, like Shakespeare in the beginning of Henry V, there's a prologue. A human being comes out as the prologue and says, okay, there's going to be an understandable necessity to have some sword fights, right? And other things that many of you do like. But if there wasn't more than that, then I would have no space for, quote, an understanding friend. Someone who stands under, who's not necessarily part of the nobility, just anyone in the theatre, but who understands what I'm doing. So I am writing for the understanding person as well as for the many. That's Shakespeare telling us how he writes. Right? And that's every significant figure in the history of writing writes like that. And that's how Plato writes. And that's very simple, but Agathon is discombobulated by this line of questioning and isn't able to answer in that way. And Socrates follows, but you would not be ashamed before the many if you believed you were doing something disgraceful. So if his standard, which he's pretending for the last few lines, that his standard is what a discerning, intelligent person thinks. That's my standard. And therefore he would be doing something disgraceful in producing a play that is merely admired by the many. And that's where he's been led to by Socrates, to revealing himself. But before Phaedrus interrupts, before this goes anywhere else, any further, and he says, "Dear Agathon, if you answer Socrates, it will not make any difference to him what effect this might have in our present arrangements, provided only that he has someone to converse with as opposed to giving speeches, especially if he is beautiful. And I myself listen to Socrates' conversation with pleasure, but I am compelled to attend to the eulogy to Eros and to receive from each one of you your speech. So let each of you repay the god and then go on conversing as you were before." So he's contrasting. For Phaedrus, it doesn't matter if someone's giving a speech or conversing. Socrates is characterized by conversing, as he obviously is in that paragraph. For Phaedrus, it makes no difference. He just listens. He's very passive. You could read the Phaedrus for confirmation of that claim. But whereas for Socrates, it makes all the difference. And then Socrates' speech is a dialogue. He turns it into a conversation, as he always does. So whenever he's put in a situation of making a long speech, he says, "I once had a conversation with so-and-so." In this case, a made-up figure called Diotima, who we'll meet next week. Okay, so then Agathon begins to speak. This is the last line on this page at 194E. He says, "I want to first to say how I must speak and then to speak." So the first 4 words, there's only 2 words that you can actually, well, 3 words you can actually translate, but I want, right? Not I think, not it's my opinion. You know, Eric Simicus, and how did Eric Simicus start? I think he said my opinion. Yeah, it seems to me a necessity. So opinion as the context for necessity, but yeah. Agathon starts with an expression of what he wants. You could almost say of will, and definitely of emphasis on himself. The first word is ego. You know, we have ego in English because sophisticated 19th century psychologists like to just introduce the Greek or Latin, as the case may be, into their discourse. So I want first to say how it's necessary that I say, that I speak, and then to speak. And it's all the same word for speak. So he's not saying, well, I'm going to say how I must set about articulating the content, and then I'm going to articulate just the same word. So that means you have speech about how to speak, and then you have speech. So your method is entirely divorced from your content. And this is a very interesting development, that these 2 things go together. The emphasis on the self and the will and a method. Does that remind anyone of anyone? An emphasis on the ego and on method. Does that ring any bells? Descartes. It's actually an uncanny anticipation, and for a very deep reason. Both of them think there are no natural principles accessible to the human mind. The modern foundational teaching, beginning with Bacon and Descartes and everyone after that, is that we must have foundations for our system. But you only need to seek foundations if there is, in opinion, no access to the principles of things. And that's the claim that most thoroughly made by Bacon and Descartes in their refutation of previous thought. That there is no access to, in ordinary experience, to principles through opinion. Whereas the classical view is that opinion is comprehensive. It contains much fiction, desire, myth, fantasy, delusion, and indirect access to the actual principles of things. So we can dialectically, which just means conversation, we can, through conversation, beginning with our basic opinions, move towards the truth. The modern view, and the view epitomized by Agathon, is that we have no direct access. So we must say how we must build our own foundation. That's drawing a long bow, but I think that there is an uncanny similarity. Now, so he says then, in my own opinion, all the previous speakers did not utilize the God, but blessed human beings for the goods of which the God is the cause. And that seems, in a sense, right. They're taking it for granted what Eros is, and they're describing either its power or the good things that come from it. Yet no one has said, what sort is he who makes these gifts? There is one, okay, that's the first statement. And now he says that he has this dual formulation that he uses throughout the speech, which is there are certain goods that Eros is the cause of, and then Eros is a sort of being who gives gifts, and these 2 things are identified. Okay, so then he makes a universal methodological statement. There is one proper manner in every praise of anything, to tell in speech, whomever or whatever the speech is about, what sort he is or what sort it is, and what sorts of things he or it causes. And this is Benedetti being extremely literal and translating sort, whereas normally you could say what he is. But he's being very attentive to do that, because there's a subtle point that Plato is making, which is that the Socratic question is, what is such and such? And that's not just random things, it's what are those things that guide our life, whether or not we pay attention to them. Like our notions of what's good and bad, beautiful and ugly, just and unjust, etc. We're guided by opinions, whether or not we examine them, admit them, or whatever. And so the fundamental question for Socrates is ti esti, what is dikaiosune, or justice, or moderation, or whatever it is. Now that's not quite this question, and that's important for what's going to happen, because he is saying what sort of thing is eros, right? Not hoios, not what is it. And he's following in this long line from Phaedrus. Phaedrus, when he first said eros, and Phaedrus is going to be argued with here, so just as a reminder, Phaedrus says that eros is the oldest god, and therefore responsible for the greatest goods, because he's old. And Agathon is going to take the opposite point of view, that he's the youngest. But Phaedrus had said, as proof of this, he'd quoted three people: Hesiod, Parmenides, Arcesilaus. Hesiod, he quotes, eros came to be first of all, no, chaos came to be and then gave birth to eros. And Parmenides, Genesis first generated eros. And then he says, Arcesilaus, if this is the original text, which Benedetti retains and Burnett and other people have changed around, but Arcesilaus agrees. So Arcesilaus doesn't contribute anything to discussion. He's just there so that there are three names, and the one in the middle is Parmenides. Now, the quote from the Parmenides is, Genesis, first of all, made eros. Now, that's Parmenides, but what's Parmenides most famous for? Not for describing Genesis, but for describing being, as being unchanging, whole, one, can't come into being, can't come out of being, etc. That appears nowhere. That's the opposite of everything Phaedrus says. He's only talking about Genesis, and so are all the others. Okay? And that will only change when we get to Socrates. So we are dealing with people who are sophisticated. They know some of the literature, but they take the side of motion and Genesis over being. And therefore, we don't ask what something is, because there is no what, as we'll see in this speech. What there is are the evolving fluidity of characteristics. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
So, with this point on motion and Genesis, I'm trying to make sense of it. So, is the distinction you're drawing between motion and Genesis versus being similar to a distinction we might draw in the philosophy of science between scientific theories that succeed in describing a phenomena simply in terms of that phenomena's relationship to our scientific instruments and other phenomena in the universe, versus having an understanding of the intrinsic qualities of the phenomena that we're trying to describe? So a relationalist understanding of something, A impacts B, and we can describe that as a law-like regularity, versus A is such and such in and of itself, or is that just a completely different train of thought?
I think that's parallel.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So
We'd have to take a few steps towards the development of the notion, say, of natural law in the modern sense and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But that definitely is an aspect of that, because, and this is brought out by Agathon, because he's concerned with how things look.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And is this also developing the idea that in the dialogue so far, we're getting different, you might say, proximate looks at the nature of eros, and it's not until we get to Socrates' speech that we get the real deal? Is this also a theme that's
I think that's the theme, that
right.
It's the most comprehensive.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now, but this is the funny thing, because he can't ask what is eros That's like asking what is being. It's not a thing.
Right.
So it doesn't correspond to that question.
Right.
So he himself has to ask, what sort of thing is it? What's the character of Eros? And it's expressed by his interlocutor, Diotima, as a daimon, which is just a word that could mean a god, but it means like some kind of divinity, right? And you know, it's used a couple of times in the Homeric passages that I just quickly translated. Which we're going to see, so we may as well read one. So Homer in the Odyssey is describing Odysseus being tossed about on the ocean before he finally gets home, as follows. Then for 2 nights and 2 days by a heavy wave he was driven, and his heart foresaw destruction. But when dawn of the beautiful hair, it's not a very poetic translation, but brought the 3rd day, at that time then the wind stopped and a windless calm came about, and he saw land close by, having taken a quick look when a wave lifted him up. Now, if you're a familiar reader of Homer, you just fall asleep for the next minute. If you're not, he's not one of the people you've read, then there is this thing called a Homeric simile. And in the middle of battle, like someone's being torn apart with a sword or something, and he'll then say, as when, and he'll refer to someone cooking chicken curry and cutting up there are all these homely metaphors for these violent, aggravated things that happen on a large scale continuously throughout Homer. And so you get a picture of everyday life in its simplicity and sometimes beauty or boringness, and these stories of what these semi-divine characters are doing, with the gods are interfering with their lives and so on and so forth. And that's part of his poetry. And it has several different effects, but one is to lend the emotion that we all know from the familiar experience to the semi-magical one. Right? So he says then, blah, blah, blah. And then now we have this simile, and as, so it's as, and then 5 lines down, so too, right? As when this, then so too Odysseus' experience. So as welcome to his children, as when life should appear in a father who lies sick, suffering strong pains, wasting away for too long, and the hateful diamond. Normally you would just translate that God. So some God who hates him, right? The hateful diamond attacked him, but then the gods released him, and it is welcome from the evil. So too, the land and wood appeared welcome to Odysseus, and he kept swimming, pressing to step foot on the mainland. So, this is part of Homer's genius, in that he intertwines these examples. Someone who you care for deeply is very ill, and then makes some kind of recovery. That strong sense of the welcome of that of those signs of life. And I don't know how I translate. Did I say life? Yeah, when life should appear. It's just the word for life. So there's an appearance of life in the person who is ill. And that's like this person who's been tossed up and down on waves, can't see anywhere, and he finally sees a little speck of shore. Now, okay, but that's a diamond. You could translate that as a god. Technically, in the Apology, Socrates makes use of the fact that daimons were also understood to be the children of gods and humans. But I just bring that up because that's going to become important in Socrates' speech, because he's going to compare Eros to a daimon. So we get a mythical, we can't have a T-esti, what is it question about Eros, because that's like asking, what is our openness to the whole? Well, what are you going to do? Are you going to describe everything that we're open to? But then you're not describing the openness, you're describing the things that we're open to. If you want a prosaic articulation of this problem, chapter 2 of book 1 of Aristotle's De Anima, he says, he has raised the question of the soul, and then in the second chapter he says, there's a couple of small problems. One is we don't know what it is because it's not something, it's our openness to everything. But if I describe everything, I'm not describing the soul. I'm summarizing, it's put much better there, and I recommend that to your attention. Okay, so, that means though, that there is a kind of perplexity in all philosophy, right? Because you're never going to come to the end of that. And that's not satisfying. And so people like Descartes and Bacon have a reasonable dissatisfaction on their side when they say, I have no time for questions that are infinite because I am finite and people are dying of easily curable diseases or some such thing. So let's have a proper science. So that's the force on that side of the question. Okay. Now, so there is one proper manner in every praise of everything. This is at 195A1. To tell in speech, whatever the speech is about, what sort of thing it is and what sort of thing it causes. So what sort and its causes. Then he expresses it mythically. This is just the way for us to praise Eros. First, what sort he is, and then his gifts. He's not going to raise the question, what is a god? Is Eros a god? That gets answered by Socrates. Eros is not a god. Right? So we start with Phaedrus saying, I'm dissatisfied with the lack of praise for the god Eros, and we end up with Socrates giving to Diotima, not himself, right? The proof and argument, in argument that Eros is not a god. Okay, so this is back to Agathon. I declare that though all gods are happy, Eros, if sacred law allow it, and it be without nemesis to say so, is the happiest of them. So if he's saying Eros is the happiest, he is saying all the others aren't as happy. And that's in defiance of the tradition, because the tradition is the gods who are always and who are blessed or happy. Right? Okay, as, that is because, so he's the happiest because he is A, the most beautiful, and B, the best. And so then we start to, this is the first articulation of the speech. So yeah, I might just put this on the board just because it's so straightforward, unlike everything else in this. So Agathon says he is a, okay, so I'm going to give you first of all what sort of thing Eros is, and then what Eros causes, or his gifts, put metaphorically. And what sort of thing? Well, he is most beautiful, and he is the best. Or, later on, he has virtue, and he's most beautiful because he's youngest, because he's most soft or delicate, because he's fluid in form, and because this is a popular saying, beauty dwells in flowers, right? And he's got a complexion that comes from dwelling in flowers. And he's best because he's the most, which one's first? Just. He's most just, most moderate, most courageous, and most wise. And this is the important one, because at the beginning of the dialogue, Agathon said, you and I, Socrates, are going to have a contest, an agon, about wisdom. Me, the poet, and you, the philosopher. So that's where he's making his claim to wisdom. Eros, in his wisdom, is embodied by poetry. Right? And then what Eros causes, and that's going to be something like all good things, as we'll see. But he says he divides this up and then he delivers it exactly according to the program. That's his neat way of discussing. Okay, so then he starts with his first description. As the most beautiful, he is of the following sort. First, he is the youngest of the gods, Phaedrus, who said the opposite. He's the oldest of the gods. And he by himself supplies a great proof of this assertion. For with headlong flight, he avoids old age. Swift though age plainly is, right, coming at us at any rate, swifter than he should, something that we all feel after a certain amount of time. So as fast as age is, Eros is faster. It is precisely old age that Eros naturally detests. It does not even come within hailing distance of it. He is always with and of the young. Now, I'm not sure what Pausanias is making of this current section of the speech. His older lover. In any case, for the old saying holds good that like to like always draws near. Now, that's actually a modification of what Homer says, which is this third quote. This is Odysseus. He's got back to the island. He's seeing a couple of herdsmen taking his flocks to go and sacrifice for the suitors who were besieging his wife in the palace. And he says, and when he saw them, he spoke a word and named them abusively, a violent and shameful word, and it stirred the heart of Odysseus. It's interesting. He speaks the word, and speaking the word stirs his heart. It's not his heart was stirred and he spoke a word. Like when you abuse someone, your abuse sets on your own anger. Yeah, as you can see in many a confrontation. Yeah, Homer makes lots of these little touches that are psychologically very insightful. Okay, now he says, now a wholly bad man wholly leads a bad man. Like there's one shepherd leading another. Just as a bad man always leads one like himself, as a god leads one like himself. So in this case, it's a bad human being leads a bad human being, or a god. And typically for Agathon, he makes it much more general and gentle. So we're going to see as we work through a couple of these quotes from Homer and other poets, that what is originally a recognition of harshness in human existence is glossed over and adorned. I just mentioned in passing, so that there's a play by Aristophanes, which has Socrates, Euripides, and Agathon in it. Right? So Plato's not the only person to put Socrates and Agathon together. Yeah, Aristophanes has done this in this play, and he describes Agathon, and this is, I think it might be written after 416, but he describes him as someone who still shaves, so he's trying to look younger than he is, and wears cosmetics. And I think Plato and Aristophanes agree that there is a certain softness and cosmetic beauty about Agathon. He's got the most ordered speech, the most thoroughly articulated and easy to follow, because he does exactly what he says he's going to do. But it may not have an inner beauty. And you know, the obvious contrast, which doesn't quite work out, is that Alcibiades comes in at the end and gives a speech about Socrates, in which he says, okay, you've got this ugly old man with a snub nose, pot belly, but inside him there are beautiful divine beings, speeches. Now, Alcibiades has misunderstood Socrates, or he wouldn't be heading off to Syracuse with the expedition. But we'll come to that. Okay, so, but there is something to that Socrates is externally, he's not beautiful, but internally, he is. And Agathon is almost the other way around. Okay, he says, though I agree with Phaedrus in many other respects, I do not agree that Eros is more ancient than Kronos and Iapetos, but I affirm his being the youngest of the gods and ever young. Right? And the events of old about gods, of which Hesiod and Parmenides speak, belong to necessity and not eros if what they say is true. Hesiod being, of course, the one who says, the Muses told me they can tell you many things like the truth, as well as the truth if they want. Otherwise, there would not have been castrations and binding of each other and many other acts of violence among the gods had eros been among them. Now he's saying the tradition is wrong. Hesiod's wrong. Eros wasn't there at the beginning. Eros did not lead to violence and the castration of the god of Kronos, of his father, and so on and so forth. That was necessity, not eros. So he's revising the tradition because he's a poet who's come to realize that poetry is making, because there is no being, right? There's only making, and so it's always new. Okay. But there would have been, okay, if eros had been among them, there would have been friendship and peace, just as there is now, since amongst the gods, which is kind of amusing if you read Homer, because they're always quarreling, just as there is now, since eros became king of the gods. Now, king of the gods. Yeah, because normally Zeus is called king of gods and men. But I didn't translate an example. So he's replaced Zeus. Now, in Hesiod, Zeus wins the war against the giants, ties up his father and so on. And then there's justice for human beings because Zeus is now taken over. Whereas for Agathon, it's Eros is taken over. But the obvious problem with this assertion that once Eros is in charge, everything is full of amity and concord is that Homer's Iliad is based upon the notion that Eros leads Paris and Helen to abandon the marriage of Helen to Menelaus and go back to Troy, and that leads to a war that lasts 10 years, and then a homecoming that lasts 10 years and includes a destruction of every single Greek except Odysseus, Agamemnon, like in 2 ships. Menelaus gets back, but there's thousands of ships destroyed, so the rocks must be covered with Greek ships from Troy down to the Peloponnese. Okay, so he is young, and besides being young, he is tender. So first topic, beautiful. First topic, qualities. A, he's most beautiful. Why? Because he's young. And secondly, he's tender. There's about 15 words for delicate, tender, soft, luxurious, all of which you could translate by any of those words, all used in this passage. So it's very hard to, you'll find no consistency among the translations reasonably. Okay, so, but there is need, okay, he says, there is need of a poet as good as Homer to show a god's tenderness. There needs to be a poet as good as Homer to show you the quality, the hoios, the character, the attributes of a god. Why? Because poets like Homer of that level make the gods. And who could do that? Well, only me, Agathon, right? Because I'm about to do it. Right? So he is saying, I am on that level. But because poetry, when it comes to self-consciousness, is making and not knowing, then I'm remaking things, as we all do. We all have to remake things as we go. Okay, so then he remakes Homer. So Homer says that Ate is a goddess and tender. Her feet at any rate are tender, saying, quote, tender are her feet, for she does not on the threshold draw near, but lo, she walks on the heads of men. Right. Now, let's go to the original. So Benedetti includes the reference, book 19, line 92. Okay, you see this last reference? That should say, I just copied and pasted, and I changed the Odyssey to the Iliad, but I did not change the number. That's 19. I thought it was, is that the one? Yeah, it is. I just translated an extra couple of lines, so it's probably from 88 to 92 or something. Anyway, so this is Agamemnon, and he's explaining why he took the woman from Crucis, from Achilles, which led to Achilles withdrawing from battle, which leads to the Greeks being slaughtered. And he says, but what could I do? A god brings all things to their end. The older daughter of Zeus, Arte, who deludes all. So her name is Arte, and when she moves someone, it's Arte, 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 right? It's just the noun is obviously derived or cognate with the verb. So she deludes, so Arte means something like a delusion that causes an error, right? Who deludes all, she is destructive. Yet she has soft feet. She doesn't approach the ground, but rather she goes over the heads of men, harming human beings, right? So back to Agathon. Agathon quotes part of it. Tender are her feet, for she doesn't go on the threshold. She walks on the head, but walks on the heads of men. So he takes the bit about the softness and completely leads out the destruction and the delusion. That's typical Agathon, right? Now it's because he has a kind of he thinks that he understands poetry as well as Homer, if not better, because he understands that if poetry is making, then you're making not in the light of some stable being that doesn't exist. You're always remaking, and that means you'll improve on Homer, as he has here. But he thinks that because you can change our comprehension of things, you can change life. Right? You can make life better through your poetry, which in one sense is obviously true. The post-Homeric Greeks are in a vastly better situation than the pre-Homeric Greeks. The post-Aeschylean Athenians are in a vastly better position than the pre-Aeschylean Athenians. Poetry makes civilization. Okay? But that's not the end of it. There's much more complexity in those poets. Aeschylus, when he founds the democratic institutions like the jury, well, he puts them into a poem, a three-part poem in the Oresteia, Agamemnon, Libation Bearers, Eumenides. It doesn't end with pure victory of civilization over barbarism and delusion. The jury at the end, who are going to acquit Orestes of killing his mother, is split. So they're not acting on knowledge because half of them are wrong. And Athena has to cast her vote, and so on and so forth. So it's a kind of there's an understanding in the third play. We only have one trilogy where we have all three plays, and this resolution includes the harshness of life, which is why the Eumenides, the Erinyes, are included in the city of Athens, and they lead the procession at the end of the tragedy. That means the desire for blood in vengeance of the mother, personified in these figures, is incorporated into the city, into the open, conversational, political city. Now, and that's exactly the aspect of life that Agathon thinks you can smooth away with poetry. So, what I'm suggesting is that Homer and Aeschylus have a broader view of life than Agathon. But Agathon takes this view of poetry that tempts him to think that you can make all of life soft. And softness is one of the main themes of his speech. Okay, so to continue after this verse, he says, so in my opinion, it is with a fine piece of evidence that he, Homer, shows her, Arte's, softness, because she walks not on the hard, but on the soft. And we too shall use the same piece of evidence about Eros to prove he is soft, for not upon earth does he walk, nor even upon skulls, which are hardly soft, i.e. Homer is wrong, but on the softest of beings he walks and dwells. For he has set up his dwelling place in the characters and souls of gods and human beings. So Eros, whatever Eros is, which we've not yet come to, dwells in the characters and souls of human beings. Now, so on the one hand, we have an emotion that is the cause of certain actions, right? And on the other hand, we have a God that has gifts for human beings, right? And he's going to try and maintain both the mythological and the unmythological psychology. Okay, we should probably take a break for 10 minutes. Sorry, I'll just... Okay, I'll go back to the text where we were, but yeah, if anyone, I've just been pretty much talking for an hour. If anyone wants to make any suggestions, or point out what struck you in the text, otherwise I'm just going to keep reading. And but yeah, feel free to interject, and especially because we've got in the time remaining, we went.
Thank you.
Alan.
Hello, Martin. I think I pointed this out to you before, and I wonder if you got an answer to it. In that text, he mentions the goddess Arte. And I said to you that in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Mark Antony's speech over the body of Caesar, he mentions Arte. And I presume that's the same goddess who's being referred to in this work.
Yeah, I'm thinking it must be. I haven't looked it up though. I will, because that's very interesting. So thanks for that. I will look it up. I'll follow up this time.
You know the quote is right at the end of that speech. Oh, pardon me, thou bleeding piece of earth. And he says, then shall Caesar's spirit, with Arte by his side, come hot from hell, shall, etc., etc.
Yep. That sounds like Arte, as we know her from personal experience.
I was interested because he says, come hot from hell.
Yeah, well, yeah, that might be a development. And Shakespeare has a rhetorical tendency to synthesize aspects of antiquity with Christianity. And so maybe there's a hell.
Oh, right, yes.
Maybe Arte dwells there rather than inflicting human beings with delusion here, sort of thing. Yeah, but I'll have a look. That's very interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks.
What does it mean to go over the heads?
Sorry?
What does it mean to go over the heads of human beings? It just means,
Well,
she's casting delusions, obviously with no one noticing, or just,
Yes. So Homer is saying, or Agamemnon, Homer has a character, Agamemnon, say, okay, I've just done something that's destroying us. It's killing everyone. It's not my fault, because delusion takes over a human being, right? The God delusion walks over the heads of human beings. And the word over, it's kata, right? Yeah. So does it mean upon, or does it mean over the top of? Difficult to say. But see, this is what Agathon's doing. He is acting like he's doing two things. One, I'm going to explain its dwelling place is in the characters and souls of gods and human beings. It's a human passion, eros, and a divine passion, because it's possessed by the gods. On the other hand, it's a separate being, which I am making in speech. I want you to picture this being as being young, delicate, fluid in form, blah, 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 right? So he's making a god. He's both making a god and explaining the cause of human action at once, which is what Homer does, but in a more sophisticated way. Now, I said that because of what you said. Yes, so in doing that, he always pictures it as having a body. So it's got a young body and it walks over the heads of human beings, but he doesn't use that metaphorically as delusion, like a mist covers your eyes. Which is another Homeric metaphor, he says that he acts as if it's actually got a bodily form, right? And it treads on the heads of human beings. And then he corrects himself, which is not quite, you're Homer, wrong. You're wrong, Homer. because skulls are hard. It treads on the soul, but that means the soul has to have like a physical form, right? And we'll get to that in the next thing. The soul is just the soft version of the body. It's just kind of, the early discussions of soul are like that in Thales and Heraclitus. Like what accounts for our ability to know all things? Thales says, well, speaking obviously when he says the first principle of all things, the archair, torn, pan, torn, hydra is water, the principle of all things, he's not saying everything is like moist and the walls are dripping, and he is saying that nous, which runs through all things, must have the fluidity of water that can reflect anything, it can assume any shape. Right? Now he's using that metaphorically for what Plato and Aristotle would just straightforwardly talk about as intelligibility, which is not physical, but it's the intellectual character of a thing. Now, Agathon obviously doesn't think there is such a thing as intelligibility. What there is different kinds of bodies seen in various kinds of ways. And so Eros must have it because he must make a god, right? So it's got to have a body. And so it walks on the soft part of the human beings, which is their inners, the character, which is very funny because character means a solidification of your way. It means hardness as opposed to openness. If you've got a character, that's something that's set. It's not permanent because you can change your character by changing your habits, but it's about the most permanent thing in a human being. That's what Pausanias said. It's that Eros is for the lasting. It's not just for the body, right? Which is nice for him to say because his body is getting old, right? And so therefore he wants to praise the character. Agathon, who he's in love with, is doing the opposite. He's saying, no, the highest thing is the beautiful body. It's very funny that these people are talking to each other like this. And the next bit is also amusing. So as he is always touching, remember Agathon said, Socrates, sit next to me so I can touch and gain your wisdom. That will come back in the wisdom section, right? He's always touching with his feet and, quote, every other part. The softest of the softest. Therefore, it's necessary that he be most tender. That is, that which enters into you most deeply must be a body, but therefore it must be a very soft body, as we'll see, fluid body. Okay, so then he goes on to God's, this is at 196a7. The God's way of living among blooming flowers. So, which is a play on an expression to do with Eros dwelling among flowers. And just as a side note, Agathon wrote a play called Anthus, which means flower, and it's remarked upon in Aristotle's Poetics. And Aristotle has some nice things to say about Agathon of the current crop. He's one of the better, but he says that he's the first person in the Anthus, in the flowers, Theban myth of some familial revenge. So I was going to reconnect the right microphone. He's invented all the characters, and that goes along very well with Plato's depiction of him as someone who makes everything anew. Now, if we come down to 196b4, he says, now this is enough about beauty. So I've discussed his beauty in those four forms, right? The many points are still omitted, but Eros's virtue must be spoken of next. Now, before we get there, though, there was something I wanted to just at 196a1, and the one last word from the line above. So he says, no, now, besides being youngest and tenderest, or softest, he is supple in his looks. Now, that's a good translation, but unfortunately it hides what is the most interesting aspect of it. It's not quite supple, he is fluid. He's like water. He's fluid in his eidos, his form. Plato very deliberately using the word that means the unchanging look of a thing, right? And Agathon uses that in the opposite respect. It means the always changing character of a thing. It means the form is the changeability of a thing. There's no such thing as a stable form. Now, this is very helpful to compare with Aristophanes. Aristophanes refers to our original nature and their aider, their forms, the round beings. So these characters are using Plato is making them use philosophical language to describe a poetic view of the world in which those words have the opposite meaning. Aristophanes describes our original nature, and it's something completely inaccessible and not knowable. We can't even articulate it in speech, which is why Hephaestus has to articulate it for us. Right? A god, a mythical creature, has to articulate it for us. And our form is something that doesn't exist and cannot exist. And if it did exist, it would destroy our current society. A form in Agathon means suppleness, right? So Plato is giving these two poets a description of our experience in which the major philosophical terms point to a world in which there is no stability and everything is made by the poets. Right. And he uses the word, so he's used the word form to go with the fluidity of form. So I'll read the next sentence. Otherwise, he would not be able to fold himself around everywhere, nor to be unobserved on first entering on or departing from every soul, if he were hard. So he's fluid. And Eros, therefore, people don't notice when he enters and departs the individual human being's soul. Okay? The harmony, I'm pretty sure he is saying symmetros. Yeah, symmetron. The commensurability, right, you could say. The harmony of his figure is a great piece of evidence for his proportioned and supple appearance. Yeah. Literally, the gracefulness, the gracefulness of Eros is a great proof of his symmetrical and fluid ideia. So there are two words that Plato uses for the principles of things: eidos, form; ideia, idea. It's very easy to misunderstand these words in Plato, because after Descartes, idea becomes anything of which we're conscious. So it's a purely subjective thing. Descartes invented the notion of a subjective and the objective. Right? There's no such thing before. That's not what Plato means. He means the aspect of a thing. Eidos, ideia. And now here, he's just had Agathon use eidos, and now he has him use ideia. The gracefulness, the proper comportment is a great proof of the symmetry. So symmetry means it can be a measure of anything, right? It can fit to anything, and the fluidity of its ideia, of its idea. Which it is agreed, so the basis of our understanding is agreement, Eros has conspicuously by everyone. That's what Agathon says.
I didn't understand what you meant by the aspect of a thing capturing Plato's understanding of an idea.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on what that means?
Well, the word means look, eidos, and ideia. And Plato appropriates this. It's in Homer. It's in the first page of Homer's Iliad. but they mean the look of something, and Plato appropriated it to mean the look of the thing to the mind as opposed to the senses. So the aspect accessible to the intelligence, so therefore the intelligibility of a thing, rather than it's what we sense in it. Yeah.
Martin,
Yeah.
I like your reference there to Descartes' introduction of the subject-object. As you know, I'm a kind of Heideggerian, postmodernist, post-structuralist, so I'm very sympathetic to other than being subject-object. It would help me occasionally, because clearly you're articulating a way of being in the Greek world that is not subject-object orientated. Maybe at times, if you could show that more clearly. For me, because I'm just so, first of all, seduced by the subject-object paradigm, because that's modernity. But I want to understand the Greek world outside that way of looking at things.
So, yeah, I may not be very satisfactory, but I can just quickly say something because it's about the way Agathon proceeds. And that's just to elaborate on what I said at the very beginning of his speech, that the subject-object distinction comes in because you're defining, first of all, the way, what can be known for certain and mathematically, and that's already subjective, right? Because knowledge that depends upon mathematics is, I'm not saying mathematics is subjective, but it's intelligible to us. It's not something that is in itself, has its own independent, intelligible being from the aspect of constructing objects of mathematics. That's probably, but we were just talking about this before, actually. What I meant before about if you set up a method the way Descartes does and the way Agathon does, and that obviously very different people doing different things, but you run into the same problem, is that your method, any method, is justified by the end that the method is going to achieve. So in Descartes' case, the goods described in part 6 of the Discourse on Method, which are themselves not mathematical, health, agriculture, mechanics, right? So physical things. But they can't be described by the method itself, which is mathematical. And we have a similar thing here. He's saying, I'm going to speak about how to speak and then speak. But that means there is contentless speech. And that's the problem that Descartes has. That he can't provide, once he's set up an idea of knowledge, he can't use that to justify the method. Now, the subject-object distinction has to do with him criticizing every aspect of our experience except mathematics. You know, how he pretends to not believe the senses and so forth. And so the simple thing is, well, and he says in the sixth meditation that is mad, right? Remember at first he says, should I trust the senses? But there are mad people who think they're kings and so on. And then at the end of the book, he says, to think like that is itself mad. So he knows that his whole project is a kind of daring, put it mildly, daring project. And that's why he has this very strong distinction between the truth by nature and the teachings of nature. The truth by nature is that which is knowable in accordance with natural law. That's objective. That is, it's based upon a method conceived by a subject who's not in contact with the world. But what I was saying before was that what Plato is doing is he admits that every speech comes from a perspective. what I'm going to give you, this is Plato, I'm putting words into his mouth, it's very unwise, but what I'm going to give you is a variety of different speeches which project a different perspective, but they're going to be examined one against the other, and they transcend the original subjectivity, to use the modern term, but they broaden the perspective upon which they are based and approach the truth. That's the promise. But you can't, and that's why he has in this dialogue, he's got Eryximachus and Agathon who make very programmatic statements about how you should speak. And he's showing that this is a deficiency. You have to start more broadly than that with our opinions about things. But yeah, hopefully a more propitious point will arise at which we can develop this discussion about how it relates to
it's also, I'm a bit slow, that's all.
Okay, so then, now, so he says, so that's the beauty, now the excellence. And the excellence is, and this is quite amusing if you've read some other of Plato, because in the Republic, when he forms this noble city, it's meant to embody 4 virtues: justice, moderation, initially, wisdom, and courage. And these are the 4 virtues that Agathon gives to Eros. And they're all, heavily ironic or beyond that. Because, okay, so the first one, he's just because he doesn't do justice or have justice done to him. Now, that's obviously ironic because someone who never does a just thing in their life cannot be characterized as just, right? Now, his justification for saying this is to quote a guy called Alcidemus, who says that in this translation, this is at C2, whatever anyone of his own accord agrees upon with another. So whenever there's full consent, right, from both people of his own accord, quote, the royal laws of the city declare to be just. Now, the way I would translate that is that the laws, the kings of the city declare to be just. So the laws of the kings of the city, and Eros is the king and the ruler of the gods. Now, whether or not Eros appearing among the gods leads to peace and harmony, as he is asserting, is one question. But the laws ruling the city does not do so without violence, right? You have to have laws with teeth in them, or you no longer have laws, as certain American cities are in the process of discovering. Okay? And then you have to reintroduce laws with teeth in them because you're suffering more violence from not having laws. Okay? So that's one of the hints that Agathon's notion that everything can work out fine and there need be no harshness in human affairs if we have enough of the right poetry, there's limits to that view. Okay, so that's justice. And then he says, and besides the share he has in justice, he has the fullest share in moderation, which is going to be interesting because Eros is characterized by a complete lack of moderation. For example, Thucydides used the word Eros 3 times in his whole history. One of them is relevant to this dialogue because it's when the Athenians were possessed by an Eros for the invasion of Sicily. And that Eros is associated with Alcibiades, who inspired that Eros, right? And he's in this dialogue, in this discussion of Eros, just before he sets sail for Sicily and Athens is on the way to being destroyed through its own ambition. Okay, so the justification is as follows: for it agreed that to be moderate means to dominate over pleasures and desires. This is a commonplace. What's moderation? And the word could be self-control. It could be actually your mind controls you. Saul phrosuner, phronein, to think truly, and source door for preserving your intelligence. Like say you're self-controlled. Your mind is in control of you, right? And that's often described as having power over pleasure. And so his justification is that, well, there's no greater pleasure than eros. That doesn't refer to eros though. That refers to the satisfaction of eros. Unsatisfied eros is as Socrates will describe, as a lack, as a pain, right? And what Agathon does, and this is his construction of, there's a human passion, it's in the souls and characters of men and gods, and there's a God, a separate being. So he is assimilating the desire with the thing that it desires, as he is in this passage. If the pleasure of eros is the greatest, therefore it dominates all the others, and therefore dominating eros is moderate because it dominates all the pleasures. That's sheer sophistry, right? Okay, so then courage. If not even Ares can resist, and Ares is the god of war can't resist eros, and it's Ares who's tied up in the net by Hephaestus. So Hephaestus is married to Aphrodite. Not sure what happened there, but he captures her. What's the expression? In flagrante with Ares. So that means, so if the god who is putatively most courageous is overcome by eros, therefore eros is even more courageous. Again, sheer sophistry, because that'd be like saying, the god who is most courageous is overcome by wine, and that makes wine. Anyway, so now that the gods' justice, moderation, and courage have been mentioned, all that remains is wisdom. So this is significant for us. So as far as I can tell, I must try to supply the omission to fill out what the God's wisdom is. And first, that I too might honour our art, the art of poetry, as Eryximachus did his art, the art of medicine. The God is a poet, of such wisdom that he can make poets of others too. At any rate, everyone whom eros touches proves to be a poet. Again, the touch conveys wisdom. Quote, though he be without the muses before. Where's that from? I think that's from a Euripides fragment. Yeah, didn't write it down. We can, accordingly, properly make use of this fact to infer that in every kind of musical making, every kind of poetry and music, eros is a good poet. For what one does not have and does not know. Now, it's a question how much knowing there is in Agathon's speech, which I've raised before, in regard to eidos and eideia and so on. Which one does not have and does not know, one could neither give to another nor teach another. And who will oppose the fact? Okay, so first, eros teaches. That is, if you're inspired by eros, anyone who eros touches can become a poet, which means there's uninspired poetry and inspired poetry. So what characterizes the inspired poetry? That they become famous. That will emerge shortly, right? That's not initially, but that will emerge. Okay, now, in between making others poets, eros is a poet, so the highest god, the youngest, the most beautiful, and the best god is a poet. Like I'm a poet, says Agathon, right? There's a very close identification between the two. He obviously takes himself to be also beautiful, and he's desperately trying to stay young. So that makes a poet, and then he says, and who will oppose the fact that making of all animals is nothing but eros' wisdom? Now that's a very telling expression, because the generation of all living beings does not occur through deliberate prudential calculation, right? Not even with many human beings in many circumstances, I would suggest, let alone with rabbits and ducks, right? But that's the wisdom of eros. So wisdom does not mean knowing something and then making a poem about it. It means some kind of force that drives you to make, right? To generate. And this will be an aspect of what Socrates talks about too. Okay, I mean, Socrates is meant to be comprehensive, to comprehend these partial aspects. And that's why I try to anticipate. Okay. And don't we know that in the case of the arts, okay, so generation, poetry, and now in the arts, whomever this God teaches, right? So making another like oneself was identified with teaching before. Teachers turns out to be famous, renowned and conspicuous in craftsmanship. Okay, so there are people who make things who are not erotic and do not become famous. There are people who are erotic and they become famous. Why? Because their eros is for fame. That's going to come, right? I'm just anticipating because it makes sense of this passage. And that he whom eros does not touch remains obscure. So archery, for example, medicine and divination were invented by Apollo. So he only mentions gods for the moment, right? When desire and love were eros. That the word love there is eros. So desire and eros guide Apollo to invent these things to become famous. So eros is a kind of desire, right? And thus he too must be a pupil of eros, a student. And to be a student of eros is to be moved by eros, which is not to learn something, it's to desire something. Right? I think that's the only way of making sense of this passage. As are the muses in music, Hephaestus in blacksmithing, Athena in weaving, and Zeus, quote, the captain of gods and human beings. Now he was replaced as the captain of gods and human beings. The pilot, pilot is the person who, they do order where the ship goes, but they're the one who steers. So it's plain that when Eros came to be among them, the affairs of the gods were arranged out of love of beauty. Now, how do those three examples exhibit love of beauty? For there is no Eros present in ugliness. But before that, as I said at the start, awesome is a translation of a word that can mean terrible or inspiring in the terrible sense. And he mentioned before the castrations, the binding of parents and so on. Many, terrible events took place among the gods, as is said. It's not something I'd endorse. I don't believe in this stuff. It's just, this is what people say. Through the monarchy, the ruling of necessity. Whereas since the birth of this God, all good things have resulted for the gods, as well as for human beings, from loving the beautiful things, Now, we have a linguistic difficulty because beautiful things, it could mean people in this case, or it could mean loving what's noble, or it could mean the effect of nobility, which is fame, glory, right? And he appears to be discussing people who make things and become glorious or famous.
Can I make a little comment? So this is just a little observation, but that passage there made me reflect on where we're at in some respects politically now, where it seems like the way people tend to view our current moment in history and our past is in terms of a past where we had an animal nature, we were just imbued with this necessity to procreate and to do what we do. But now what's great about modernity is we have these desires and we're able to organize society in such a manner as we can just meet these desires with ever more rapidity. And I just thought I'd throw that out there because I thought that's interesting. It's a transition from animal necessity to, we have a certain amount of freedom, but it's just the freedom to meet desire in a hedonic sort of fashion. But there's no sort of reason and contemplative third alternative there. I don't know if that's helpful or relevant.
No, I'm broadly sympathetic because, in modernity, the lack of natural principles leads in two directions. One is human beings, we can recreate ourselves. We can be, as Descartes says, like masters and possessors of nature, like gods, right? We can replace the last God. We'll be God. And on the other hand, it leads to disappointment with that, because if there are no standards by which to judge our own divinity, then the beauty, the ability of our creations depends wholly upon our having esteem for them, which means they're completely fragile, and we become disenchanted, and we think that human beings are rubbish, and or that, you know, AI is real intelligence because human beings are just low-level computers, and so on, right? And so modernity is characterized by this huge ambition and aspiration to creativity and disenchantment and dissolution. And we sort of go rapidly between the two for the same reason, that there are no standards by which to judge our works. And that relates to, and that is the relation between agathon and the moderns that we're making ourselves. Okay, so at 197c, he says, thus Eros, in my opinion, Phaedrus, wrong, stands first, because he is the most beautiful or noble and the best. So he's done his first thing. What sort of thing is Eros? And after this, he is the cause for everyone else of the same sort of fair and good things, of beautiful or noble and good things. So he's noble and good, and the source of the noble and good, as a god or as an aspect of the psyche that's left in obscurity. It occurs to me to say something in meter. It's actually, the word for making poetry, it comes to me to speak something in meter, in verse, that Eros is the one who makes poetry. And then there's two lines of poetry. Yeah, and he's got that he is the one who makes, and the word for making can mean compose verse. Right? So Eros makes poetry, and then we have two lines of poetry, but they're not, he's not saying that he makes poetry, he's saying he makes these things. He makes peace among human beings, and calm for the ocean, windless calm, and sleep, bedtime of the winds, and sleep amidst care, right? So the bedtime, I emphasize, because it's not, he doesn't say the winds rested. I mean, Benedicti quite correctly has the resting of the winds. That's completely fine. But it means the time you go to sleep. So he makes that for the winds. So we project upon nature as a whole our human capabilities. Right? Eros produces this. Eros produces peace among human beings and produces sleep in care by controlling nature as a whole, poetically, right? And that I think is described in the next line. He empties us of estrangement. It's a word that means otherness, right? He fills us with attachment, and the word is oikeotetos. It makes everything to be of our oikos, of our home. For something to be oikeos is to be intimate with it because it's part of your household. Okay? So poetry makes the world familiar and intimate to us, but by remaking it, it's not the actual world. Okay? And he's given us an example of himself doing just that. So then we have this very dense description of what he does. I'll read through it, just make one or two comments. So he arranges in all such gatherings as this, our coming together with one another. In festivals, in dances, in sacrifices, he proves himself a guide or a leader, providing gentleness, banishing wildness. Yeah, so Eros is civilizing, and it provides for the institutions, you could say, of civility. So, loving, giving, giver of amity or kindness, no giver of enmity, gracious, propitious, good, spectacular, looked upon by the wise, and wondered at by the gods, wonderful to the gods. Enviable to those who don't have it, right? Desirable to those who have a good share of it. Father of luxury, splendor, glory, graces, yearning, and longing. So, Eros, longing, is the father of longing, right? So caring for good ones, careless of bad ones, in toiling, in fearing, in longing, in speaking, the best governor, mariner, fellow warrior, and saviour. The ornament of all gods and human beings, the fairest and best guide, whom every real man must follow, hymning beautifully. So, and sharing the song Eros sings in charming the thought of all gods and human beings. So when he got on the stage a couple of days ago with the chorus, he led a song, or this is what the chorus leader does in a play written by Agathon or anyone else. The chorus leader leads the song, usually the song to a god. Right? And Agathon here is saying every man must follow, hymning beautifully Eros, sharing in the song Eros sings, Eros who's been identified with poetry. And what does that do? It charms the thought, deludes the thought of all gods and human beings. So it makes the world amicable for us by charming us or enchanting us. It's a strong word for the effect it has upon our thought. So it doesn't alert us to the truth or anything. That's not the role. Whereas Socrates is going to argue that at the core of Eros somewhere is a desire for the truth. And he finishes by addressing Phaedrus, who is the first person who said, I want to have speeches on Eros, please. And he says, let it be dedicated to the god, sharing, as far as I am able, partly in playfulness and partly in measured earnestness, seriousness, a moderate seriousness. Yeah. And that I mentioned before will be picked up at the end of the dialogue. Now, Aristodemus said that when Agathon had finished speaking, all those present applauded vigorously. We don't get that response from anyone else. We get Eryximachus say, at the end of Aristophanes' speech, he says, that was pleasant, and I think everyone else found it to be pleasant. Presumably they were laughing, but there was nothing like this, right? So Agathon, again, has pleased the theatre, right? As the youth had spoken in a way that suited to himself as to the god, right? Because he made himself like the god, or rather, he made a god that was like him. Right?
Haven't they all done that though?
Well, but they haven't discussed Eros as a god. So they were told to. Everyone's going to provide an encomium to the god. But this is the first one. So Aristophanes talks about what is Eros in Aristophanes? It's a suffering, right? It's something, a pathos. It's something that our ancient nature suffered. And if we could cure it, it would be great. But the tension in his speech is between the fact that if we cured it, then we'd be back to our original situation of assaulting the gods, and the gods would turn us into stellae, into outlines.
But everybody else has, though. Phaedrus.
But how has Phaedrus? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Phaedrus says
describes
he's
him
the
as
oldest
an
god.
Yeah.
Right. And then he immediately says, because the greatest good you can have as a young person is a lover. And so, and because they will die for you. Right? So there's no connection between the cosmic attribution of Eros as a god and the passion, the human passion. And so why do Agathon, so Pausanias develops that and says, well, there's two Eroses. There's the contemporary one, which foolishly loves women as much as boys, right? And there's the ancient one. Now, and Eryximachus too says that there's a double Eros. Now, they appear to be suggesting by saying this ancient thing that that's their way of saying natural. It's more natural. And they try and find a ground. Well, Phaedrus doesn't bother. Pausanias tries to find a ground for that. Why is my attraction more natural? Well, it's because of intelligence. That doesn't work. It's because it contributes to your character. And everyone agrees, the laws agree that you should be of good character. But it ends up being, I think, an amusing description of the development of moral character. Now, certainly, the lover's not even tested. Well, the lover is tested by showing patience with the beloved, but all the work is done by the beloved in resisting the lover. But yeah, any other thoughts about Agathon? Yeah, every time I read any of these speeches, I just think I need to reread this 5 more times because there's always so much more there. And the allusions to other texts, which I followed up a couple, but there's many more I haven't. Any questions or thoughts?
I can offer a little comment. Maybe I've made too many at this point, but one thing I was thinking of there is that with all these speeches, the thing that I find most interesting typically is that aspect of love or eros that is left out. So in Agathon's speech, he's speaking about love in terms of its, let's say, Costco marketable qualities. You know, its softness and its lightness and its niceness, its easiness. But love can be a sort of a devastating force, as we've talked about. And then there's a few other examples with the other speeches, but I suppose this reflects perhaps what Plato's up to with the dialogue, where he's got these several speeches, all of which are designed to, in some way, occlude part of what eros actually is, and where we're getting closer to what eros actually is by being able to notice what's missing from the speeches. So that's just a personal reflection on what I'm getting out of these speeches at this stage.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that's how we're meant to see things, and then we're meant to wonder what is partial about Socrates' view, because Plato is not unconditionally endorsing. He doesn't tell us anything. He just gives us this speech, which clearly Plato is promoting philosophy, and Socrates appears to be his main paradigm of a philosopher. That doesn't mean there's no criticism, and we have to see what, like there's this way of teaching, of reading Plato, that when I had already rejected it before I went back to university to study philosophy. But the way people would present it in classes is there's a dialogue in which one character is a mouthpiece for Plato. And what he says in that dialogue represents what he thought at that time. And then he writes something else 6 weeks later and he has a different view. And that's why there's tensions between the dialogues and so on. Obviously false. Transparently false. Plato describes in 55 different ways how that's false. And so he presents Socrates. And I use the word paradigm because that's how Socrates describes himself in the Apology. He says, understand me as providing you with a paradigma, a model for a way of life. He doesn't, so don't repeat my speeches. Now, Plato, I think, is doing that on the whole. And this is when he talks about poetry. He talks about the construction of paradigms and so on. And he is providing us with a paradigm for the best life as a philosopher. But that doesn't mean there are no limitations to it. And that's why he has, in the closing days of Socrates' life, in his fictional literary life that Plato creates, he has a stranger from Elia, who's the most important philosopher for Socrates and for Plato, Parmenides. The first dialogue that Socrates participates in when he's about 20 years old is the Parmenides, where he gets trounced. Then at the end of his life, a stranger from Elia, who is from the school of Parmenides, comes to him and he says, perhaps you've come to refute me, right? And he produces a discussion on philosophy, which is meant to be as follows. We're going to discuss the sophist, the statesman, and then the philosopher. we discussed the sophist, and he provides a picture of Socrates. So it's the philosophical version of the political trial that Socrates is undergoing. So Plato is perfectly capable of providing a critique of Socrates, and yeah, that we'll try and see what we think is there. But first of all, we've got to try and understand it, and that's hard enough. No, thank you very much for your attention. I'll just pause the recording.